Who needs Europe's militarization? European political freeloaders expect that they will have it all. And for them, there will be no consequences, even if something or everything goes wrong. Even if the war for which they are borrowing money never happens, the Euro elite will still take their cut. Less than 5 years after the European Union adopted a grandiose economic recovery plan following COVID, the bloc now has another, even more ambitious program, this time for the militarization of Europe. France and Britain are eagerly, though somewhat incoherently, discussing the necessity and possibility of deploying their peacekeepers in Ukraine. I assume the quotation marks require no explanation. At the same time, they keep reducing the number of troops they plan to send. The Spanish government is pushing through a €1 billion transfer to Kyiv, bypassing parliamentary approval, even though lawmakers want to know how this money will be, or has already been, spent. The European Parliament is voting to provide Ukraine with yet another €3.5 billion in aid, whether as loans or non-repayable grants makes little difference. The European Commission is debating whether to allocate another €40 billion or €20 billion to Ukraine in the near future. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has announced mandatory military training for Polish citizens. The European community is in danger, proclaim EU media. Rearmament is non-negotiable. The creation of a unified European army is essential because the threat from the East is inevitable. War costs money, far more than the €723.8 billion that was allocated, or rather, borrowed, to restore the EU economy after the pandemic. And the €800 billion now being demanded for additional military spending is just the beginning. War is an expensive endeavor, for most, and a profitable one, for a select few. Oversight of the funds handed over to the military-industrial complex is minimal and highly restricted, while the earnings of weapons manufacturers and, more importantly, the kickbacks funneled to various EU financial institutions are enormous and largely invisible. Look up why the European Commission, read, exclusively Ursula von der Leyen, grossly overpaid Pfizer for its so-called COVID vaccine. This is not a question of millions, it's a question of billions. Before ascending to her current position, the EC president served as Germany's defense minister. Under her watch, certain foreign consulting firms provided services to the Bundeswehr for €700 million. Yet, according to German experts, domestic consultants could have done the same work for €165 million. Why were foreigners chosen? Ursula has yet to answer. But as it turns out, that initial deal was no fluke. She expanded her practices to the pandemic response, and now she has convinced her EU colleagues and the forces behind them that another massive loan is needed for collective defense and security. The repayment of this debt will be distributed among EU member states, likely for generations to come. Economists analyzing the COVID era primarily point to the accelerated concentration of capital that took place. Restrictions disproportionately affected small businesses, independent producers, self-employed individuals, and entire industries such as transportation and tourism sectors that had previously been fragmented or privately owned. As a result, large capital was able to buy out many of these businesses at reduced prices and, once the pandemic ended, maximize its profits. It makes little sense to argue over how dangerous the virus was or how effective the vaccine turned out to be. The outcome is clear: the erosion, collapse, and bankruptcy of the middle class. The situation played right into the hands of big capital. Western media insist this was purely coincidental. And today, another such coincidence is unfolding. What awaits Europe, now that it has agreed to take on nearly €1 trillion in debt? The EU economy is suffering severely from the loss of Russian raw materials. No one will acknowledge this too loudly, as it would contradict the European Commission's policies, but the profitability issues plaguing key sectors of German industry prove that sanctions have backfired on Europe like a boomerang. In such conditions, jobs must be saved through loans but not for the development of civilian sectors like the recovery of battered transportation and tourism industries. That kind of investment won't be approved because the profit margins are too low. Electronics is an even worse bet. Price competition with China could drive profitability in that sector down to zero. The best investment for borrowed money? War. War is more profitable. This is beyond doubt. It has been a constant throughout human history. And since European resources in Ukraine are largely depleted, new ones must be extracted. Where? In Russia, of course. Or rather, on its territory, because extraction does not mean establishing joint ventures. It means dismemberment, seizing whatever can be taken and forcing the surviving Russians to dig up and pump out everything that remains. This, European politicians explain, is why a new army, rearmament, and a massive loan are necessary. Though it's uncertain whether they truly fail to grasp history's lessons or simply believe that another Drang Nok Osen won't end in an even greater disaster than the last. The real trick is that the war may never happen at all, but preparing for it is immensely profitable. European officials will issue the orders, and they will also be responsible for overseeing their execution. Few competitors exist. Expert assessments are kept to a minimum, and those involved are carefully selected. Pulling off financial fraud has become even easier than during the pandemic. The Germans have considerable experience in this regard from the last century, when industrial magnates like Thyssen and Krupp invested in Hitler's Endstab, which later repaid them with lucrative military contracts. Even though the Third Reich lost the war, no one ever held these capitalists accountable. Today's European political middlemen and opportunists believe they will get everything they want. And they assume they will face no consequences, even if something, or everything, goes wrong. Even if the war they are borrowing money for never materializes, the Euro elite will take their share while the ordinary people will be left to foot the bill.